Muhammad was born in 570 AD. Either shortly before or soon after his birth, his mother and father died. And therefore his uncle gave him to be raised by a very spiritual tribe called the Hanifa, the pure ones, the trusted ones. The Hanifa were probably the only monotheistic tribe left on the Arabian Peninsula that maintained the Sabian religion. They were the ones who were preparing for a fulfillment of their prophecy, a prophecy that anticipated the coming of Muhammad. They were to Islam as the Essenes were to Christianity. Now you got to remember, most of the Essenes, in fact, I don't know of a single Essene that ever became a Christian, but they were the ones who were preparing themselves for it. So Muhammad was raised by this very spiritual tribe. He had no formal education and therefore remained illiterate in his entire life. He could neither read nor write. He became a merchant and was known as, in his teen years, as an individual with stainless character. He would devote his free time to developing charities particularly for orphan children like himself. Orphans are given special recognition in the teachings of Muhammad. He also cared for the sick and gave monies to charities and helped found some charities. He was a highly advanced human being even in his teen years. He was taller than average. For sure, he was very handsome. Had long black hair and was very comely. He was, however, as growing up, extremely upset with the tribe to which he was born, the Quraysh tribe, because the tribe had become wealthy in renting out space in the Kaaba, in the temple that Islam believes was originally built by Adam and his son Seth, again rebuilt by Abraham and Ishmael as a monument to monotheism. It was that temple that these pagan tribes had now placed their idols. The Sabian religion had the same traditions about the story of Abraham as we have in the Old Testament. So he knew, not only because he was a messenger of God, but he would have known anyway about how Abraham went in and destroyed the idols in the temple. When he was 25 years old, he fell in love with a widow who was 15 years older. She was beautiful, she was intelligent, and highly successful in her caravans. They married, and during her lifetime, he never had more than that one wife. He practiced monogamy for the next 20 years or more. The relationship between Muhammad and Khadijah, the name of this woman, was so advanced that it is considered one of the great love affairs in all of history. They consulted on everything together. They made decisions together. Muhammad always cleaned up his own dishes, mended his clothes, and swept the tents. He did many household chores. It is impossible for any of us to understand what it means, the love between a messenger of God and his cohort. The reason why it's impossible is because none of us understand what true love is anyway. We strive towards it, and in each age we gain a little bit more insight into it. But the messengers know what it is. And the wives of the messengers are those rare experiences of actually having experienced what true love is. One day he was walking with his wife Khadijah and his young daughter Fatima. Fatima would become a great friend to Muhammad. They would have a very special relationship. In fact, the love between Fatima and Muhammad was so great that when he died, she could not recover from the grief, and she died from grief. But when she was a small girl, he went out with his wife Khadijah and Fatima. They went to their favorite spot, which was near a mountain that he would go up to pray, in a cave on a mountain. And he prayed there since he was a young man. But on this one occasion, while he was praying, an archangel Gabriel appeared to him and startled him and announced to Muhammad that he would now be the mouthpiece of God, the apostle of God. And his mission was to rejuvenate the morals and the character of this barbaric people. Muhammad protested bitterly, according to tradition, saying, "How can I, a humble servant, be such a messenger when I am illiterate? I can neither read nor write." And Gabriel will tell him, "We will be your voice and your hand." This is why, in Islamic tradition, the Quran is considered the words of Gabriel. Now, who is Gabriel? Gabriel is the same reality of the voice in the burning bush. The same reality that landed on Christ's shoulder and announced Christ to begin his mission. That same reality that appeared to Buddha in his meditations, and to Zoroaster when he visited the archangels in Ahura Mazda, and to Baha'u'llah as a floating image of a handmaiden that appeared before his eyes when he was in the dungeon of Tehran. It is that holy, most holy of holy spirits, the most Holy Spirit, which emanates directly from God and appears to the messengers. He ran down from the cave in total dismay and in shock, and ran to his wife and put his head in her lap, and she covered him up with her cloak because he was shaking with fear. Now, my friends, it is my feeling, my understanding, that spiritual reality of a messenger of God knows who they are at the time of birth. There are no surprises. They're all knowing. They have an eternal reality. Their existence is from the beginning that hath no beginning to the end that hath no end. But there is that human side. They dwell in the human temple, and it's the human side that we relate to, that we can understand. And that is the human aspect that often gives these kinds of reactions. The first to recognize him as a messenger of God was his wife, Khadijah. It is my belief that there is a woman who is the first to recognize every messenger of God in the past. It is either the mother, the sister, or the wife. The second to recognize Muhammad was his 9-year-old cousin, Ali. It will be another 1,200 years or more that a similar thing will happen to a messenger of God. In this case, the first to recognize him will be another 9-year-old boy. It will be Baha'u'llah's son, Abdu'l-Baha. His cousin Ali, who at the time was 9, would later marry his daughter Fatima and become the first imam, the first successor to Muhammad, of a series of 12 successors. Khadijah dies, as I said, after 24 years of marriage. Muhammad will have 12 other wives, including 2 Jewish women and a Christian woman. And we'll talk about why he had so many wives. Because Muhammad taught monogamy. Hagera. In 610, he was so persecuted with his new mission because he denounced the idol worships that his native tribe so valued that they formed coalitions to eliminate both Muhammad and his followers, that they fled from Mecca to Medina. That's called the Hagera. And the Islamic calendar starts on that flight, AH, after Hagera. And that was in 611. The calendar that would be established by Muhammad would be different calendar than we have today. It would be based on the lunar calendar, since the moon was a great symbol of time in the tribes prior to his coming. You see, a messenger doesn't change everything. They try to accommodate as much as they can of things that are not of great significance, but help the people. Most of the rituals that occur during the Hajj or pilgrimage come from the pagan religion. The circumambulation was a pagan ritual. The throwing of rocks was a pagan ritual. But these gain new meaning now under the Islamic teachings. You see how this works. You take the same form but give it new meaning, because it helps the people. Now he was asked by his followers as well as the Christian and Jewish people. Now where were they? He's on the Arabian Peninsula. I didn't know there were any Jews or Christians on the Arabian Peninsula. There were. They lived in villages. And Muhammad went to visit them and to teach them this new religion. And they said, how can you claim to be a messenger of God? By what right do you have that? Which is a legitimate question, my friends. And he said, I claim it from the prophecies of your own religion. In Genesis, it says, I will make him, Ishmael, a great nation. I am a descendant of Ishmael. I am creating that nation. And then he refers to the prophecy in Deuteronomy. He says, I shall raise up a prophet like unto thee, Moses. And then Muhammad said, verily, restating, now listen to this, he's telling you what Moses actually said. So you have what's in the scriptures, and then he's telling you in another way what he says. A messenger claims the right to interpret all previous scriptures and to give meaning. In fact, they claim to have the sole right to do that because they claim to have all knowledge. And what we often hear from a messenger is what really happened, or what was really said, or more importantly, how we can better understand what happened. And this is what he said. Verily, this is Moses speaking, verily we have sent unto you an apostle, even as we sent an apostle unto Pharaoh. Then his disciples said, Muhammad, as well as the Christian clergy, how can you claim to fulfill that prophecy? Because Jesus claims to fulfill that prophecy. You cannot claim that. And Muhammad said, I am all the prophets. I am Jesus. And then Jesus, he says, now listen, carefully. Jesus said in the gospel, this is what this is Jesus, John 16. For if I go not away, the Comforter will not go unto you, come unto you. This is right out of the gospel. Muhammad said, this is what Jesus actually said. I am God's apostle unto you to confirm the law, and to announce an apostle that shall come after me, whose name shall be Ahmad. Now, Ahmad is the Arabic word for comforter. It also happened to be one of the names of Muhammad. The Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, is comprised of recorded sayings of Muhammad over 23 years, from 610 to 632 AD. It was recorded by memory, which is the primary means, not the kind of memory we have today, my friends. You know, today we play that game where you put people in the party in a circle and you start out with a message. By the time it gets around the circle, nobody recognizes it, right? Because our memories are so bad. Our ability to say what was said to us is so undeveloped. But you see, back then, before people could read, memory was much more important. Famous story of the man, one of the missionaries, who went to Africa, and he brought with him books, and the tribe he was teaching had never seen a book before. And so he explained to the chief of this tribe that a book can record the traditions and sayings. And the chief wept, an uncontrollable weeping, and then raised his head and said, I am so grateful that such an invention has come into being, for to carry the traditions uncorrupted from one generation to the next has been such a heavy burden. It's beautiful. But back then, the traditions were kept. The other forms of recording on palm leaves, on stones, on the bones of animals. But Muhammad himself, before he died, gave specific instructions to his followers that within a few years after his death, they were to compile all of these sayings from all of these sources and put them together in a book called the Quran. And they were to do it scientifically. Here's this illiterate man who is to give instructions of how to create a scientifically authenticated book. It was done by collaboration of different sources of the same saying. You need at least two people who could independently cooperate. Otherwise, it could not be put in. It was so advanced that even today, it holds up in scholarly circles. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars all agree that the Quran is the first authenticated scriptures we have. It consists of 6,200 verses. 1/3 is history of religion, going back to Adam. It covers the same stories as we find in the New and Old Testament. It tells about Moses and his adventures with the Pharaoh. It talks about Abraham and the sacrifice of his son. It talked about Jesus, the virgin birth, and his encounters with the Sadducees and Pharisees. In other words, if you were to read the Quran, you would have everything that you needed to know about the Old and New Testament. When one of the early believers of Islam were being chased by the persecutors, they fled to Africa. And the members of the Quraysh tribe were in hot pursuit. They arrived at a Christian African village where the king of that area gave them asylum. When their accusers arrived, they demanded that the king hand them over. And the king then turned to these two early followers and said, I will see if they are from God or not. And he says, tell me of the story of the birth of Jesus. And from the passages they received from Muhammad that they had memorized, they quoted these passages to the king, talking about the glorious birth of Jesus. The king was so overwhelmed by the beauty and the depth of understanding that he began to weep, and he told the pagan persecutors to leave. For he said, these men are surely Christians, even though they call themselves Muslims. One-third is laws. At no previous religion had so many laws been revealed until the Quran. Laws covering the giving of alms, of fasting, of prayer, of women, a whole chapter on giving rights and privileges to women, protecting their station. Laws in business, in warfare, in running society. We will see some of these laws become critical in the Renaissance because they give, in my opinion, they are the seeds to Europe's enlightenment. And then 1/3 are prophecies that forecast the future, that tell of the time of the end, the day of judgment, when the earth shall become another earth, when the mountains will be crushed and the heavens cleft asunder. There is no scholarly translation of the Quran. The only authenticated version is in Arabic. However, we have a number of English translations. Now, what is it contain? What are the eternal laws? Remember, there are two types of teachings. Ones that are eternal, that basically never change, like the Golden Rule. The others are social teachings that must change from age to age as humankind changes. He verifies the oneness and unknowability of God. He is God beside whom there is no God. No human perception comprehends him. He states, actually, in my opinion, with that phrase, the basis for future philosophers as to the limitations of human perception. He talks about the oneness of religion. He said, all of the prior religions are Islam. Islam means submission to the will of God. In every religion, you must submit to a higher will. You see, my friends, this is actually a very advanced concept. If we as Christians and Jews had studied this, we would understand what free will means. But we don't. We think free will is doing whatever we please to do. But the purpose of free will was actually not the child-type freedom that we talk about. It was a higher freedom. The freely choosing through recognition of truth that a higher reality is to be submitted to, not to human reality, not to a king, not to a political party, not to an ideology, not to science, not to our possessions, or our prestige, or our hopes and wishes, but to the one true God, and all other things are secondary. That is the highest submission. That is the purpose of free will. This will be clarified and expanded by the great Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, in his Critique of Practical Reason. He said, there is oneness of the books of God. They're all chapters of the Quran. The first chapter brought by Adam. The second by Abraham in the form of the scrolls. Moses brought another chapter called the Torah. David brought another chapter called the Psalms. And Jesus brought the most recent chapter called the Gospel. And I bring you the latest chapter called the Quran. You see, Quran means to be recited. In the Quran, it is forbidden to read the Quran. One must chant it. You see, reading scripture is a modern phenomenon. You go to all the ancient faith traditions, they all chant the holy verses. This is why we shouldn't be too upset if we find in the Baha'i writings thou and thee. At least you don't have to memorize different chant and hymns to it. The oneness of the prophets, he claimed. See, you have the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, the oneness of the books, and the oneness of the prophets. Now, actually, it's my understanding that onenesses that Muhammad proclaims were actually intrinsic in Abraham's religion. That if you understand what Abraham brought, he brought all these onenesses, but the people weren't ready to hear it. It took thousands of years before humanity was ready to hear these onenesses. He said that the prophets have a twofold nature. On chapter 2 of the Quran, it says, "No distinction do we make between any of the prophets." Earlier in the chapter, it says, "Some of the prophets we have caused to excel the others." His followers protested, "Muhammad, why do you do this? You do this all the time. You say one thing and then you contradict yourself. You said that we cause some to excel, and then later you said we make no distinction. Which is it?" He replied, "Yes." He said there's also, now we'll talk about the distinctions, and we'll talk about the apparent contradiction, but right now I want to get through this section. In addition to the twofold nature, he said there's a twofold station. There is the human station. "Only what is revealed to me do I follow." Christ said the same thing. He later says, "I am a servant. I eat and sleep like a servant. Poverty is my glory." You see, Muhammad had to go to the other extreme of making his divinity low-keyed. Why? Because the Christians had turned Christ into the Godhead, which he called a blasphemy, to identify the man Christ with the unknowable essence. How could the unknowable essence come down in a human form? So he de-emphasized his divine nature, but he states his divine nature when he said, "I am all the prophets. I am the voice of God." See, that's the divine element. So let's look at this a little bit. I think it's very important to understand. Again, we go back to our concept of content and context. You see, my friends, whenever you see a contradiction, apparent contradiction in the holy writings, you must understand these are infallible sources. They're not doing this out of ignorance. This is what many of the intellectual community think, that these prophets aren't worthy of study because they make all these stupid contradictions. When in reality, they themselves are the ones who don't understand and who are ignorant. The content and context are two different realms. When you see a contradiction, it usually means one refers to here and the other refers to here. I am all the prophets is content. I am a servant like you is context. The Holy Spirit that emanates to all of these messengers is content. The human temple in which it appears is context. When he says, we make no distinction. No distinction. It's content. We have caused some to excel the others. The others, okay, is context. In Baha'i writings, it will say, all successive revelations excel the previous ones by necessity, because human capacity has increased, requiring a greater magnitude of revelation. But it is the natural consequence of evolution that each successive revelation excel all previous ones. How else could they fulfill all the previous religions if they did not excel them? You see how this works? If you're going through mathematics and you go from additions and then on to multiplications, would it be considered appropriate that multiplications be of lesser intensity than additions? Lesser complexity or abstractness? No. Additions is the least complex. Calculus is the most complex. By its nature, it must become more complex, not by any inherent superiority of messengers or their revelation. No more than we can claim that the calculus teacher is superior to the additions teacher. It's just that they have different jobs, commensurate with the requirements of the student at that stage of their maturation. This one understanding would eliminate much of the conflict between religions we see today. Social laws. He said, you must love the Jews and the Christians. He who wrongs a Jew or a Christian will have me as his accuser. He told the Muslim men to marry Jewish women. He himself married 2 Jewish women. But you're not to force her conversion to Islam under no circumstances. In fact, he said, if you live in a village that has no synagogue, you are obligated to build her one. He said the same about Christian women. You must build them a church. Let's see. When the Jews and the Christians formed a union with the pagan tribes to destroy the early Islamic communities, caused a great deal of suffering and hardship, many of the followers went to Muhammad and said, why, Muhammad, must I learn about Jesus and Moses when their people are such enemies of our new faith? Why do I need to know about them? Why do I need to accept Jesus or Moses? And Muhammad made this famous statement, if you reject Moses or Jesus, you reject me, for we are one. My friends, if you do nothing else, get nothing else from this lecture series, take from it the understanding that what these divine messengers brought and what the people today do in their name can be entirely different. He gives 4 human rights. He is the inventor, have you, the first to proclaim the whole concept of human rights. These are the 4 human rights he gives. Freedom from want, meaning that he abolishes the right to allow people to live in poverty. He makes it a violation of divine law. Freedom from fear and tyranny, makes it a violation for leaders to tyrannize their subjects in any way, form, or fashion that would hinder their spiritual development. Freedom of speech, but responsible speech, speech that adds to the edification of humanity, not irresponsible speech, which we call freedom of speech. And he gave freedom of belief. These 4 freedoms would be the foundation of a new kind of society. That we will today call the nation state. This is why the nation state is attributed to Muhammad, because he provides those spiritual principles by which a more diverse and complex society can establish unity around. He abolishes completely all forms of racism. When given a gift of an African slave, he immediately frees that slave. The first Muslim societies would be the first truly race-free societies that the world will have ever seen and would have yet to see to this day. We are just now approaching, in some segments of humanity, the kind of bias-free, race-free social fabric that existed 700 to 800 AD. Courtesy and cleanliness. He set the first modern standards of hospitality and table manners. When the Pope ordered the first Crusades in 1095 AD, he sent the sons of the aristocracy as the officers of the Crusades, perhaps the most educated and refined people of Europe. And they entered the Arabian Peninsula and the Arab territories with their great armies, ready to do battle with their full armor. And what they found instead were women and children greeting them with platters of fruits and inviting them to their tents so they could serve them dinner and to show them hospitality, according to their teachings in the Quran. These officers were so overtaken by the kindness and the gentleness and the hospitality that were unknown in their own countries, that many of them, within a short period of time, purchased homes, threw off their armor and put on silks which was an invention that was brought to Europe by way of Islam. Began to learn Arabic, read many of the Greek classics for the first time. And you now see the beginning of the Renaissance. The introduction to the great thoughts of the Greeks and the innovations of Islam being brought to Europe through the armies of the Crusade. In the first crusade, very few people were killed, relatively speaking. These officers came back, instead of riding their horses in full armor, they were wearing silk garbs. Armor was being either dragged behind with horses or thrown into wagons. They brought back numerous gifts for the Pope. Arabic books that described a new architecture, a new concept called the zero, new foods and fruits that were unknown in Europe, new ideas regarding philosophy and science, expecting that the Pope would be overjoyed with these gifts. But when the Pope saw that they had not brought back the heads of the Arab infidel, he fired the aristocracy, basically told them to go home. And then he sent couriers over to northern Germany to round up a group of people called the Hessians. These are the people, if you watch the movie Gladiator, at the beginning of the film were the barbarians who fought the Romans. These were the people that were hired by the Pope to go over to the Holy Land and conduct warfare. My friends, these people were not interested in the zero, nor were they enamored by hospitality. And there began the great conflagration of the Crusades, the killing fields, the mass murders that we are today still suffering the aftermath. Women's rights. He gave them the rights to own property. Remember now, before Muhammad, women were lower than property. Now they could own property. He gave them the right to divorce their husbands. He gave them the right to inherit. He forbid that when a man died, his wife automatically became the property of his son. He outlawed that. He abolished the practice of killing female children. And he limited the number of wives that men could have. This is what he says in the Quran, in chapter on women. I use mathematical notation because it's simpler. You are permitted to marry 1, 2, 3, or 4 women at one time. That's the number of wives have to be equal to less than 4. Okay. Immediately got protests from particularly the wealthier Arabs who could afford more than 4 women. Most Arabs couldn't even afford 1. See, but a few could afford many. And we have a similar thing in the United States right now, except it has not to do with women and its shareholders. Same principle. If and only if, he said, you can treat them all equal. His followers finally accepted, well, okay, I'll go along with 4. And for sure, we'll treat them all equally. No problem. Now listen carefully. This is the law. Then he puts an addendum on the law later on. He said, it is impossible to treat more than one wife equally, equitably. Well, see, this is progressive revelation, my friends. See, religion is about change. You know religion is in deep doo-doo when it ceases to change. This, in my opinion, is a clear statement of monogamy. The reason why Muhammad had many wives had nothing to do with this. It had to do with his one authority to do whatever he wants to do anyway, because we can never understand the reasons. But secondly, because in those days when his followers were killed, there was no other way to protect the women. And to illustrate the harmony between Judaism and Christianity and Islam, he married women of different faiths to illustrate. He did by example. So there are many complex reasons. But anybody who studies this man and his beauty and his humility, his enormous humility, would not attribute to him as being a sex addict. That's what happens in the churches today, my friends. So, who practiced monogamy? His cousin, Ali, married his daughter, and after Fatima died, he never remarried again. To even show the point, even though remarriage was possible and still uphold monogamy, he never remarried again, to simply illustrate the importance of monogamy. This is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Limits on warfare. It's from his teachings that Abu Bakr will later put the limits on warfare. He said warfare must be defensive only. That you should leave intact the entire infrastructure of your enemy so that after the battle they can go back and provide for their people. You must not touch their women or their children. And you must treat prisoners with dignity and nobility, because they're human beings. See, all of this based on the teachings of Islam. It took another 1,200 years for the Geneva Convention to come together in 1863 and to adopt the first protocols on limits on warfare. And then again, after World War II, they had to redo it again. And today, we have innumerable violations of these principles that were laid down 1,400 years ago. He left no will or testament. The Shias believe, however, his true successors are the Imams. The Sunnis took a different path, and they had as authority the caliphs. Today, there are probably 14,000 sects of Islam. He warned his people that if you divide this faith into multiple sects or denominations, you shall be known in the latter day as the lowest people on the planet. The prophecies of Islam is the promised one for the Shias, the Qayyim, who is the 12th Imam, the descendants of Ali in 12 generations or so. The 12th Imam disappeared as a child, and the prophecy is he will return at the time of the end and bring in a new order. The Sunnis, ironically enough, have exactly the same prophecy as the Christians. They are awaiting the return of the Spirit of Christ. So, my friends, let's have a break, and then we'll get on to the Renaissance.